Have you ever opened your door in the dead of winter to find a stranger standing there, shivering, eyes filled with a fear they won't speak of Elias Crow, a man who'd chosen solitude after losing everything? Faced that moment, one snow-bitten night. On his porch stood Clara Reyes, barefoot, bruised, and running from men who saw her as something to claim. What would you do if letting her in meant bringing danger straight to your home, yet turning her away might mean sending her to her death? This is a story about the choices that define us, about courage, quiet kindness, and the way two people can change the course of each other's lives when the storm is at its worst. Stay with me and see what happened after he opened that door. If you find this story touching, comment 1 if you think this video needs improvement. Comment 2. The storm had been building all evening, the kind that rolls down from the high plains with a growl in its throat. By midnight, the sky over Dry Creek was a black wall of ice and wind. Hailstones rattled against the tin roof of Elias Crow's ranch house, each one sounding like a small hammer strike. Elias had been sitting in the worn armchair by the wood stove, nursing the last inch of coffee from a tin mug when it came 3 sharp knocks at the front door, not the kind that wait politely for an answer. These sounded like someone hanging on to the last shred of their strength. Then a voice, muffled by the howl outside but edged with desperation. "Please, let me in. They'll find me." Elias set the mug down slowly, eyes fixed on the door. It had been years since anyone had come to his ranch this late, in weather like this. Folks in these parts knew better than to be on the road in a hailstorm unless trouble was chasing them faster than the storm itself. His right hand slid toward the Winchester propped against the wall. Habit. Not paranoia. Just the reflex of a man who'd lived long enough to know that the wrong choice about who you let inside can cost you more than your life. He rose from the chair, his joints complaining as he did, the old wound in his left hip biting with each step. The lantern on the table flickered as the wind pressed hard against the walls. The knocks came again, softer now, but no less urgent. Elias paused at the edge of the door, his fingers resting on the iron latch. In his mind, memories stirred like dust in a cold barn. Another night, another knock, years ago, when his boy was still alive. That knock had brought nothing but grief. He'd sworn, standing over a fresh grave, never to answer the door to trouble again. But the voice outside had not begged for food or shelter in a way that felt rehearsed. It had been raw, uneven, like someone talking past pain they didn't have time to explain. He took a slow breath. The wind drove another sheet of hail against the siding. If he waited much longer, whoever was out there might not be able to knock again. With one motion, he lifted the latch and pulled the door halfway open. The cold rushed in first, biting at his face. Then the figure appeared, a woman, mid-20s, soaked to the skin, hair dark and plastered to her cheeks. Her eyes caught the lamplight, wide and sharp despite the trembling in her body. She wore a torn shawl over a faded dress, the hem caked in mud. One boot was missing entirely, the other was split at the sole, water dripping from it onto the porch boards. Her hands were raw, the wrists marked with deep red grooves as if from rope. Elias took her in with one measured glance. He didn't see the wild look of someone drunk or desperate for theft. What he saw was a person who'd been running hard and had nothing left to run on. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm roared around them, wind curling between the gap in the door. Her lips parted as if to speak again, but all that came out was a faint, ragged breath. "Inside," Elias said at last, stepping back from the door. She didn't rush forward, didn't stumble into him like a drowning swimmer grabbing a rope. She crossed the threshold slowly, keeping her eyes on him as she did, as if making sure this wasn't a trick of its own. When she was clear of the doorway, Elias shut the door and dropped the heavy bar into place. The air inside was warmer, but only by degrees. The wood stove threw a steady orange glow, and the scent of pine smoke filled the single-room cabin. She moved closer to it without a word, holding her hands toward the heat. The steam rose off her shawl in thin wisps. Elias watched her for a few seconds, then took a clean quilt from the cot and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair by the stove. She obeyed, but not with the obedience of someone beaten down. It was careful, measured. He stepped around to the small cupboard, poured water from the kettle into a tin cup, and set it on the table beside her. "You can warm up before you tell me anything," he said quietly. She didn't answer, only nodded once and wrapped her fingers around the cup. Her eyes stayed on the flames in the stove. Elias leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her in the firelight. The marks on her wrists told one story, the fear in her shoulders told another, and somewhere between the two, he felt the stirrings of a choice he hadn't wanted to face for years. He glanced toward the door. The wind was still up, but the knocks from earlier seemed louder now in his mind, not because they'd been forceful, but because they'd been honest. Outside, the storm rattled the walls. Inside, the only sound was the hiss of melting ice on the stove and the slow, careful breaths of the woman who had just stepped into his life. Elias didn't yet know her name, but he already knew one thing for certain: whatever had driven her here wasn't finished yet. The quilt hung heavy across her shoulders, its faded patchwork soaking up the damp from her clothes. Steam rose from the hem as the fire licked heat into the room. Elias had seen all manner of folks in his years on the trail drifters, thieves, men with lies in their eyes, but the woman sitting in his chair wasn't any of those. Still, trust wasn't a gift he gave lightly anymore. He poured a second cup of water, set it on the table for himself, and lowered into the chair opposite hers. The chair legs creaked. The sound filled the small silence between them. Outside, hail rattled down the stovepipe, each strike a reminder of the storm they'd both just outlasted. Her hands curled around the tin cup, fingers still trembling from the cold. She didn't drink. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stove, as if willing the flames to keep burning. "You came a long way to be out here," Elias said finally, his voice low, almost cautious. No answer, only a slow breath that carried a hint of hesitation. He didn't press her. Questions could wait until she felt the walls weren't closing in. Instead, he nodded toward the kettle. "Soup's warm. You should eat while it's hot." She glanced up, then quick, searching, and nodded once. When he ladled the thin broth into a bowl and set it before her, she took it without thanks, but not without care. Each spoonful was small, deliberate, like she'd learned a long time ago to make food last. Elias leaned back, studying her in the lamplight. The rope marks on her wrists had darkened since she came in, the skin there swollen. A faint bruise trailed along her collarbone, visible where the shawl had slipped. He knew better than to ask how she'd gotten them. Scars had a way of telling their own stories, whether a person wanted them told or not. "You hurt anywhere else?" he asked. Her eyes flicked up to his, then back to the soup. "No worse than the weather," she said, her voice soft, accented, but steady. It was the first full sentence he'd heard from her. The way she said it, half truth, half shield, told him more than the words themselves. For a while, they sat with only the storm for company, every so often. Elias caught himself looking toward the door, not out of fear she'd bolt, but out of habit, listening for anything besides the weather. You didn't survive his kind of life without keeping an ear tuned for the wrong kind of knock. She finished the soup, setting the bowl neatly on the table. Her gaze swept the room, the single cot, the small shelf of books, the rifle hanging by the door. Her eyes lingered on the rifle a moment longer, not with fear, but with recognition. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." Her lips pressed together in thought, as if weighing the next question, but she didn't ask it. Instead, she shifted the quilt closer around her and leaned slightly toward the fire. Elias rose and crossed to the corner where a stack of dry clothes sat folded old work shirts, wool socks. He set them on the arm of the chair beside her. "You'll catch your death in those wet things. Change by the stove. I'll give you space." He took his coat from the peg and stepped onto the covered porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The air outside was sharp, biting into the skin, the kind of cold that made a man's lungs feel lined with glass. Through the window, he could see her silhouette in the firelight, small, deliberate movements as she peeled away the soaked layers. It struck him that she'd stepped into his life the way the storm had, suddenly, without warning, and impossible to ignore. When the door opened again, she was sitting back in the chair, wrapped in the quilt, his shirt and socks hanging loose on her frame. The tension in her shoulders had eased just enough to make room for exhaustion. "You can take the cot," he said. "I'll bed down here by the stove." She didn't argue. Her eyes followed him as he spread a bedroll on the floor, her expression unreadable. The fire crackled, the storm easing into a steady patter of hail, turning to rain. For the first time in years, Elias realized the quiet in the room wasn't just his own. As he lay back, staring at the low rafters, he heard her shift on the cot. The quilt rustled softly, then stilled. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. A thought settled in his mind. He didn't yet know why she was here, but he knew enough to be certain of one thing: the storm outside wasn't the only one that had driven her to his door. Morning came slow to Dry Creek, a pale wash of light pressing through the frost-rimmed window. The fire had burned low, but the air still held the memory of heat. Elias stirred from his bedroll, the ache in his hip flaring as he pushed himself upright. From the cot, Clara was already watching him, quiet, alert as though she hadn't slept deeply at all. "You're up early," he said. "Didn't sleep much," she replied, voice low. He nodded, not asking why. Sleep didn't come easy to those who had too much on their minds. Elias stoked the fire, adding split logs from the stack near the stove. The scent of pine resin filled the cabin, mixing with the faint tang of damp wool from the quilt she still clutched. "Coffee?" he asked. Her eyes flicked toward the steaming kettle. "If you have enough." He poured her a tin cup first, then one for himself, setting it on the table beside her. Her fingers wrapped around it, lingering over the warmth. For a long moment, she stared into the dark surface as if reading something there. "You've got rope burns," he said finally, nodding toward her wrists. Her hands shifted under the quilt, hiding them from view. "They'll fade." "Some things don't," Elias said, his tone even, without judgment. That brought her gaze up to meet his. There was a flicker there, defiance, maybe, or the fight to keep from saying more than she meant to. She set the cup down carefully. "I worked for men who don't like to hear no," she said at last. "They paid me to cook, then decided I belonged to them. I left. They didn't like that either." Elias didn't ask how she'd gotten free. The fact she was here, breathing, was answer enough. "You figure they'll come looking?" he asked. Her eyes went to the window, the pale light catching the sharp line of her cheek. "They will. I just don't know when." A gust rattled the cabin walls, and for a second it was hard to tell if the shiver that passed over her came from cold or from memory. Elias moved to the cupboard, pulled down a small tin of biscuits, and set them on the table. "Eat," he said simply. She broke one in half, chewing slowly. After a few bites, her shoulders eased just enough to show she'd noticed the gesture for what it was, a way to keep her steady without pressing too hard. When she'd finished, he pulled on his coat and stepped toward the door. "I'll check the stock. You can stay by the fire." Her chin lifted slightly. "I can work. I'm not broken." He paused at the latch, meeting her eyes. "I didn't say you were." The look that passed between them was brief but heavy, an understanding traded without more words. Outside, the ground was a mix of frozen ruts and new puddles where the hail had melted. The horses shifted in the corral, steam rising from their backs in the cold. He checked the fence lines, his mind turning over what Clara had said. By the time he came back inside, she'd swept the floor, folded the blanket from the cot, and was ladling more water into the kettle. The quilt still hung over her shoulders, but her hands moved with the surety of someone used to keeping a place in order. "You didn't have to," he began. "I know," she said, cutting him off softly. Then, after a beat, "It helps to keep busy." He understood that. Work had kept him alive after his own loss, given his hands something to do when his mind was too full. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. "If they do come, there's a rifle by the stove. You know how to use one?" A small nod. "I've used worse." The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that came when two people had both seen enough of the world to know there's no need to fill every space with talk. Still, the thought lingered in Elias's mind like the low hum of a distant storm, the kind that gives no warning until it's already on your doorstep. The morning sun never broke fully through the clouds, but by mid-morning the storm's edge had drifted east. The air still held a bite, but the light had softened enough to show the world wasn't all ice and shadow. Elias pulled on his coat, glancing toward Clara as she stacked kindling by the stove. Her hair was still damp from the night before, loose around her shoulders, catching the faintest gleam from the window. "I'll need to check the east fence," he said. "The wind might have brought it down." "I can come," she offered, almost too quickly. He shook his head. "The ground's still slick. You stay here, keep the fire going." Her jaw tightened a fraction, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached for the broom leaning against the wall, the movement easy, practiced like she'd kept more than one rough place in order before. Elias stepped outside, the ground crunching under his boots. The corral was quiet, the horses shifting lazily, their breath white against the cold. He found the fence intact, but in need of tightening, and spent the better part of an hour with hammer and nails. His mind circling the same thought, a woman on the run didn't knock on a stranger's door unless she was truly out of choices. When he returned, the cabin smelled faintly of sage and bread warming in the oven. Clara looked up from the table where she was mending a tear in the quilt. "You bake?" he asked, lifting the lid to peek inside. "I make do with what's here," she said. Her hands didn't stop moving, the needle catching sunlight as it rose and fell. Elias poured himself water, leaning against the counter. "You keep busy." "It keeps me steady," she replied, not looking up. They ate the bread warm, spread with the last of the summer preserves. The meal was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that didn't demand conversation. Later, he showed her where he kept the spare tools. They worked side by side, repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. Her small frame braced against the wind while he set the new bolts. She didn't complain, even when the cold stiffened her fingers. By late afternoon, the sky shifted a hard gray sliding in from the west. Elias felt it in his bones before the first gust reached the ranch. "Storm coming," he said. Clara straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "Not like last night, not hail," he said, "but colder." They hauled extra wood inside, stacked it high near the stove. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's cry cut through the gusts. Elias poured coffee while Clara stood at the window, watching the horizon as if she could see through the weather. Her fingers tapped lightly against the sill. "They're not out there now," he said. She didn't turn. "I know. I just—" Listen for hoofbeats. Her words settled between them, quiet but heavy. He remembered that feeling the way a man listens for something he fears, even in the wind's false echoes. Night came early with the storm clouds. They ate stew, the heat of the broth chasing away the cold. Clara told him, in pieces, about the last place she'd worked the kitchen in a dusty roadside inn that doubled as a meeting place for men who dealt in stolen horses. She had cooked for them for months, keeping her head down until the day one of them decided she belonged in more than the kitchen. She didn't finish the story, but Elias didn't need the rest to picture it. When the lamps burned low, he unrolled his bed near the stove. The wind outside pressed against the cabin walls, a low, steady push. Clara sat on the edge of the cot for a while before lying down, the quilt pulled tight. Long after the fire settled into embers, Elias lay awake, listening. It wasn't just the storm he heard. Somewhere beneath it, in the rhythm of the wind, there was something else, a sound that didn't belong, a faint, distant echo, like hoofbeats on frozen ground. The sound came again, faint but certain. Elias's eyes opened fully now, fixed on the black ceiling beams above him. The wind carried many lies, but this was not one of them. Hoofbeats. He pushed himself up on one elbow, listening harder. The rhythm was uneven, as if more than one horse was moving over frozen patches, the stride breaking on rocks, far yet but closing across the room. Clara stirred beneath the quilt, her head lifting just enough for her eyes to find him in the dim glow of the coals. "You hear it too," she whispered. He nodded once. "Stay down. Don't light the lamp." She sat up anyway, the shadows hiding most of her face. "That's them." Elias stood, the floor cold under his bare feet, and crossed to the peg by the door. The Winchester came down, smooth, the woodstock familiar against his palm. He moved to the window, easing the curtain just enough to peer into the night. The moon hung low and thin, its light slipping through breaks in the clouds. Down past the rise, along the trail from the creek, shapes moved dark against darker, their breath faint plumes in the cold. 3 riders. He felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. They weren't coming to trade. Clara's voice came low from the cot. "If they see my boot tracks from yesterday, they won't get that close," Elias said, though a part of him knew the ground out there told stories he couldn't erase. He stepped back from the window, eyes sweeping the room. The rifle leaned ready. The extra shells sat in a small tin on the shelf. His revolver rested in the drawer by the table. "Under the bedroll," he told her. "There's a pistol. If I tell you, you use it." She didn't argue. Her hand slid under the bedding, coming back with the Colt. She checked the cylinder without looking at him, a quick, sure motion. The hoofbeats slowed outside, the sound muffled now by the wind. Then silence. Elias held his breath, every sense straining. They could be circling. They could be dismounting. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Then came the creak of leather. A low voice carried just far enough on the air to make out a word or two. Lights inside. 2 of them. Clara's fingers tightened around the pistol grip. Elias moved toward the door, every step deliberate. The barn was too far to reach without being seen. The fence line offered no cover worth taking. This would be here, Now, outside, the crunch of boots on frozen dirt. He raised a hand toward Clara without looking back, a silent order to stay still. Her breathing slowed. A fist pounded against the door, the sound heavy and impatient. Crow. The voice was rough, strained against the wind. Open up. We need a word. Elias knew the tone. Men who wanted a word in the middle of the night rarely meant just talk. He stood still, letting the seconds stretch until the fist hit the door again. Won't ask twice. His mind worked quick. 3 men, maybe more just out of sight. Clara, behind him, with a gun she clearly knew how to use. The fire behind them, throwing light that could make a target of either one. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. If they push through, go for the one in the middle. She nodded once, her eyes fixed on the door. The bar across the door held, but the knock turned to a shove, the wood groaning under the weight. Elias braced himself, the rifle raised. Outside, the wind rose, carrying a scatter of snow from the ridge, and with it came the sound of another horse fast, approaching from the east. The men outside turned at the noise, their voices sharp, confused. It was enough for Elias to draw a slow breath, his finger steady on the trigger. The night had just shifted. The sound cut through the wind, fast hooves pounding frozen ground, closer with every breath. Elias kept the rifle steady, but his eyes shifted toward the window. The 3 men outside had turned, their shapes tense in the pale light. The newcomer rode in hard, no hesitation, snow and dirt kicking up in his wake. In the half-light, Elias caught a glimpse of a long coat, a broad hat pulled low, and the glint of a badge on the rider's chest. Sheriff Miles Porter. The 3 men shifted uneasily, their shoulders squaring, but their weight leaning back toward their horses. The sheriff didn't slow until he was nearly on top of them. "What's your business here?" His voice cut sharp through the wind. One of the riders spat into the snow. "We're just looking for someone. No law against asking."
"There is when you pound on a man's door in the dark," Porter shot back, reining his horse sideways to block their view of the cabin. Inside, Clara had moved closer to the stove, but her grip on the Colt stayed tight. Her eyes locked on Elias. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Outside, the sheriff's horse stamped and snorted, the tension rippling through both man and animal. "You've got 2 choices," Porter said. "You ride back the way you came, or you ride into town and we talk about your warrants." That word warrants hung in the air like a drawn knife. The leader swore under his breath, swung his horse around, and after a pause, the other 2 followed. They rode slow at first, then faster once they reached the rise, their shapes swallowed by the dark. Elias let out a long breath, the heat of it clouding the cold air inside. He lowered the rifle but didn't set it down. The sheriff dismounted and rapped twice on the door, not hard, just enough to announce himself. "Crow! You gonna let me in, or am I talking through the wall?" Elias opened the door a hand's width, the cold rushing in around them. "Porter!" The sheriff stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. His gaze swept the room, taking in Clara, the bedroll by the stove, the quilt still around her shoulders. He didn't ask her name. Not yet. "You expecting callers this time of night?" he asked. "No," Elias said. Porter nodded toward the door. That was Bram Larkin and 2 of his hands. "Mean lot. I've been trailing them since yesterday." Clara's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the quilt. The sheriff's eyes flicked to her, then back to Elias. "You want to tell me why they'd be riding this way?" Elias met Clara's gaze, giving her the choice. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. "Because I left them," she said.
and they don't take kindly to that." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if a piece of a larger puzzle had just clicked into place. "They'll try again," he said. "Larkin doesn't walk away from something he thinks he owns." Elias's jaw tightened. Then he'll find out he doesn't own much around here. Porter glanced toward the window, reading the horizon like only a man of the plains can. "I'll circle back before sunrise. Keep the fire low, and keep the door barred." He stepped out into the cold, mounting up in one practiced motion. The sound of his horse's hooves faded into the night, leaving only the wind and the low crackle of the stove. Elias shut the door, sliding the bar back into place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "You didn't have to stand with me." Elias looked at her, his voice even. "Yes, I did." The fire popped softly, sending a faint spray of sparks against the stove's iron walls. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the knowledge that trouble had only been delayed, not ended. The night after the sheriff left, the cabin held a quiet that felt too fragile to touch. Elias sat at the table, cleaning the Winchester in slow, practiced motions, while Clara moved between the stove and the shelf, putting away what little food they had left. The wind had died down, but it left behind an emptiness in the air, the kind that made every small sound carry too far. "They'll come in daylight, won't they?" Clara asked without looking up. "Likely," Elias said, sliding a clean cloth along the barrel. "Men like Larkin want to be seen when they take something. It makes the fear stick." She poured water into a small tin pot, setting it near the fire to warm. "I don't want you in this because of me." "That's not how it works," Elias said. His voice wasn't hard, but it left no room for argument. She turned then, leaning against the counter, the light from the stove catching her face. "You ever waited for trouble like this before he met her gaze? Enough to know it's better to be ready than to pretend it isn't coming." The hours that followed were measured in small, ordinary movements. Elias checked the hinges on the door twice, then pulled the shutters tight over the windows. Clara cut strips of old cloth into makeshift bandages and set them on the table beside the ammunition tin. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them no longer felt like strangers holding their breath. When night deepened, Elias spread his bedroll near the door. "You take the cot," he said. "If they come before daylight, they'll have to step over me to get to you." Clara's lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. She lay down, the quilt pulled to her chin, her eyes staying open long after she thought he'd fallen asleep. By dawn, the frost on the window had turned the first light into a dull silver glow. Elias rose and poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one by her side. "We'll need to check the traps and bring in the rest of the wood," he said. She pushed herself up, rubbing her hands together. "And if they're already out there, then we find out what they're made of," Elias replied, his tone steady but low. They worked in the yard that morning, the cold biting at their fingers, their eyes scanning the ridge without speaking of it. Every creak of saddle leather, every distant crack of a branch, made them pause and listen. By midday, no riders had appeared. The wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off. Clara's shoulders eased slightly, but Elias didn't relax. "It's not over," he said quietly. She glanced at him, reading something in his face. "You've got that look like you're already somewhere else." "I'm thinking about the fence line," he said. "And where they'll come from when they do." She studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, worn rosary. I'm not much for praying anymore, but maybe today's an exception. Elias didn't answer, but his eyes softened. That afternoon, clouds gathered low over the hills, the air turning heavy with the promise of snow. Elias cleaned the rifle again, more to keep his hands busy than from need. Clara baked cornbread, the warm scent filling the cabin, a small defiance against the cold outside. As evening settled, Elias stepped onto the porch. From the ridge, the land rolled away into shadow. No riders, not yet. Behind him, Clara's voice carried softly through the open door. It's strange. I almost feel safer here than I have in years, even knowing what's coming. He turned back to her. Maybe it's not the place. Maybe it's who's standing with you. Her eyes met his for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them. Then, just as the first snowflakes began to fall, the sound broke the quiet far off, but clear enough to make the air feel thinner. Hoofbeats. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady now, each one punching through the hush of falling snow. Elias stepped back into the cabin, shutting the door behind him with a quiet finality. They're coming, he said. Clara didn't flinch, but the quilt slipped from her shoulders as she reached for the Colt on the table. Her fingers worked the hammer back with a sound that felt sharper than the wind outside. How many, she asked. Can't tell yet, Elias said, pulling the Winchester from its place by the wall. But it's more than one. The fire crackled in the stove, casting a warm glow that suddenly felt out of place, too gentle for what was at their doorstep. Elias crossed the room, doused the lantern, and the cabin sank into a dim half-light. Outside, the rhythm of the hooves shifted, slowing as they reached the yard. Leather creaked, harness chains jingled, voices murmured low, their words blurred by the snow. Elias moved to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain. Through the white swirl, shapes emerged 3 horses, then 4. Men hunched against the cold, their hats dusted with fresh snow. He let the curtain fall and looked at Clara. This is it. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. Then let's end it. A voice called from outside, loud enough to carry through the storm. Crow, we're here for the girl. Hand her over, and we'll ride away. Elias didn't answer. Snow ticked against the glass, the silence inside thickening. The voice came again, sharper. You've got no stake in this. Step aside. Elias's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara not for permission, but to let her see the choice in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod. He stepped to the door, speaking just loud enough to be heard through the wood. She's not yours to take. There was a pause outside, then the sound of boots hitting the ground. Snow crunched under their weight as they spread out. Elias moved back to the window. They're fanning, he whispered. Clara crossed to the far side of the room, taking position where she could see the back corner of the cabin. Her shoulders were squared now, her breathing even. A shadow passed the window close. Too close. Then came the scrape of something against the wall. They're trying to draw you out, Clara murmured. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. Then they picked the wrong night. From outside, a man's voice shouted. Last chance Elias didn't give one back. The shot cracked through the snow, the recoil firm against his shoulder. A yell answered from the dark, followed by the thud of boots retreating. The yard erupted, horses snorting, men shouting over the wind. A round struck the side of the cabin, splintering wood near the window. Clara returned fire, her shot quick and sure, the muzzle flash lighting her face for an instant. The storm swallowed the noise almost as fast as it came, but the fight wasn't over. Elias caught movement at the edge of the porch, a figure crouched low, inching toward the door. He sighted down the barrel, breath steady, and squeezed. The man dropped, snow blooming red beneath him. Clara reloaded with quick, precise motions. "They'll fall back," she said, "but not for long." Elias nodded. Through the hiss of the snow, he could hear them pulling away, regrouping out of sight. The storm was working in their favor now, cloaking every move. Inside. The two of them stood in the dim cabin, breath showing in the cold air, the silence heavy, but alive. Elias looked at her. "They're not done." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned steady. "Neither are we." The snow fell harder now, thick enough to swallow the shapes at the edge of the yard. Elias moved to the window, but the storm blurred everything beyond 20 yards into a gray curtain. "They're out there," Clara said quietly from her place near the stove. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles stayed white on the Colt's grip. "They're waiting for us to tire out," Elias replied. "And they think the cold will do the rest." He stepped to the door and checked the bar, feeling the grain of the wood under his palm. Then he crossed to the table, sliding another handful of shells toward Clara. "Keep these close." They settled into a tense rhythm. Every few minutes, one of them would move to a different angle, checking the windows, listening for the crunch of snow under boots. Outside, the wind moaned low across the ridge, making it hard to tell where the danger was coming from. At one point, Elias thought he caught movement, a shadow slipping past the barn, but when he raised the rifle, it vanished into the white. Hours dragged. The fire burned low and had to be fed in small pieces, so its glow wouldn't give them away. Elias could feel the cold creeping in through the seams of the walls, touching the skin on the back of his neck. In the quiet, Clara spoke without looking at him. "When I left them, I didn't have anywhere to go. I just knew I couldn't stay. The first night, I thought the cold would kill me before they did." Elias glanced at her. Her eyes stayed on the floor. "But then I saw your light," she continued, "and I almost kept walking. I thought maybe you wouldn't open the door." He didn't answer right away. "Finally," he said, "I almost didn't." Their eyes met then, something passing between them that wasn't about the fight outside. It was about all the nights before this one, the ones they'd both spent alone. A sharp crack outside broke the moment, not a gunshot wood splitting. "They're breaking into the barn," Elias said, already moving. He stepped to the corner window, sighting through the narrow gap in the shutter. Two shapes bent low against the wind, one holding a lantern shielded in his coat. They were working at the barn door, the light glinting off metal. "They want the horses," Elias murmured. "Cut our way out if we run." He drew in a slow breath, lined up the shot, and squeezed. The nearest man dropped, the lantern tumbling into the snow. Its light snuffed in an instant. The second bolted into the dark, shouts carrying faintly over the storm. Clara moved to cover the other side of the cabin. "They'll rush the porch next," she said. "Then we'll be ready." Elias answered. The minutes that followed felt like hours, each one stretched thin by the wind's howl and the pounding of their own hearts. Somewhere in the dark, Larkin was deciding whether to finish it now or wait for morning. Clara reloaded, her hands sure despite the cold. "They'll keep coming, won't they?" "Yes," Elias said. "Until they find out what it costs." She looked at him then, and there was no fear in her face, only resolve. The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, snow piling at the door. Every sound outside was swallowed fast, leaving only the fire's low hiss and the slow, even breaths of two people who knew the night wasn't done testing them. And then, just as Elias thought they might have until dawn, came the sound they'd both been waiting for. Boots on the porch. The step on the porch stopped. Then the wind slipped through the door's edges, a cold whisper that felt like a warning. Elias stood with his shoulder against the frame, Winchester in hand, listening to the beat of his own heart against the storm's breath. Clara shifted to the far wall, her Colt raised, eyes locked on the door. Crow. The voice was rough, drawn out, carrying through the wood. Bram Larkin. You've taken enough from me tonight, but I only came to take one thing back. Elias stayed silent. Snow tapped lightly against the roof, and the night seemed to lean in, waiting. You keep her. You die here. Larkin went on, his tone not loud but cutting like cold iron. Give her over, and I walk away. Clara's breath was steady. He talks like I'm something to trade. Elias turned his head just enough for her to catch the look in his eyes. He faced the door again and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. If you want to cross this threshold, Larkin, know it'll be the last step you take. The silence stretched. Then came the creak of leather, the metallic slide of a revolver leaving its holster. A boot crashed against the door the bar held, but the wood screamed. The second kick splintered a plank. Move in boots pounded on the porch. The door buckled under another hit, snow and wind bursting through the crack. Elias fired first. The blast lit the room, sending a man reeling off the porch.
Clara's shot followed, shattering the post beside another shadow, forcing him back into the storm. But Larkin didn't retreat. He shoved forward, shoulder through the gap, revolver raised. Elias swung the barrel and fired the shot, ripping through Larkin's coat, spinning him toward the rail. Snow clung to his beard as he struggled to rise. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Clara stepped forward, boots crunching in the drift. Her Colt stayed leveled, unwavering. This isn't running anymore. Larkin, she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. This is where I stand. His eyes flicked from her to Elias and saw the same unbreakable thing in both. The wind surged, a curtain of snow sweeping across the porch. When it cleared, two of his men were already pulling him away. They vanished into the white, swallowed by the storm. Elias lowered the Winchester, the weight in his shoulders finally easing. He stared into the night until there was nothing left to see but the snow. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had all night, though the fire burned low. Clara set the Colt on the table, her fingers slowly uncurling. She didn't sit. She moved to the stove and fed the fire, watching the flames catch. Elias closed the door, slid the bar back into place, and looked at the cracked plank. It would need mending. So would other things. You still want to stay? He asked. Clara turned, the firelight soft across her face. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks in the yard. Inside, the coffee was hot, the fire steady, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them had to face the night alone. The door would be fixed, the breaks in the walls sealed, and when the wind came back over Dry Creek, it wouldn't just be singing to the empty hills. By late March, the last of the snow had pulled back from the ridges, leaving the ground soft and dark with new life. The wind no longer carried ice in its teeth. Instead, it moved gentle through the cottonwoods along Dry Creek, rustling the first green leaves. The cabin door had been repaired weeks ago. The fresh plank stood out against the weathered boards, but Elias had left it that way on purpose, a reminder of the night they held their ground. Clara was in the yard, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the soil of a small garden bed. A row of fence posts stood behind her, each one set straight, the work they'd done together before the thaw. Her hair was tied back with a strip of blue cloth, her boots marked with mud instead of snow. Elias came from the barn, carrying a bucket of feed for the mare. He watched her a moment before speaking. "Ground's warming quick this year," he said. She looked over her shoulder,
smiling faintly, means the seeds will take. The routine between them had settled without forced mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons in the yard or on the trail, evenings by the fire. It wasn't the kind of life either of them had imagined, but it was one they both recognized as worth keeping. The sheriff had ridden out once in early spring to say Larkin's gang had scattered, some taken by the law, others gone to ground far from here. Neither Elias nor Clara asked where. They didn't need to. One afternoon, Elias found Clara standing at the fence line, looking out over the hills. Her hands rested on the top rail, and her eyes followed the trail that wound down toward town. Thinking of leaving, he asked. She shook her head slowly. I was thinking. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to see the seasons change. Elias leaned against the post beside her. Then, maybe this is the year you do. She glanced at him, something steady and unspoken in her gaze. They didn't need more than that. By the first warm evening, the creek was running high with meltwater, its voice carrying up to the cabin. Clara hung a line for drying clothes, the fabric swaying in the breeze. Elias sat on the porch, sharpening a blade in the fading light, listening to her hum an old tune. There were no hoofbeats on the wind now, no shadows moving at the edge of sight, just the smell of fresh earth, the sound of water over stone, and the knowledge that the worst of the winter was behind them. Inside, the fire still burned at night, not out of necessity, but for comfort, and, sometimes, in the quiet between them. Elias would look over at Clara and realize that somewhere along the way, without either of them naming it, she had stopped being a guest. She belonged. Here. Some storms in life arrive without warning, not always in the sky, but in the form of people, choices, and moments that test who we are. Elias Crow's choice to open his door to Clara Reyes wasn't just about sheltering someone from the cold. It was about deciding that compassion is worth the risk, even when the safer path is to turn away. For many of us, especially in later years, life has carved deep lines, losses, regrets, hard lessons. We know what it is to guard our hearts. But this story reminds us that sometimes the act of letting someone in can be the very thing that brings warmth back into our own lives. Kindness doesn't erase the danger or the hardship, but it changes the way we face it. It gives us reasons to stand firm, even when the wind is at our door. So perhaps the lesson is this: we can't control every storm, but we can choose who we stand with in the middle of it, and that choice might just be what carries us both through to calmer days. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next tale. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and it means more than you know.